Daddy, why does that man look like you? Mia's small finger stayed pointed at the towering portrait above the lobby, and every head in the glass-bright room turned at once. Ethan Callahan stood frozen beside the marble reception desk, one hand wrapped around his worn leather briefcase, while the security guard stepped in front of them and said they needed to leave immediately. Thomas Reed kept his polished smile in place, but his voice had gone thin as he reached for the visitor log, trying to cover the moment before anyone could really see it. Mia did not move. She only looked from the portrait to her father and whispered, "That's Daddy." 3 hours earlier, the air in the lobby had smelled like cold stone, coffee, and expensive perfume, and Ethan had walked in with the careful silence of a man trying not to disturb anything around him. He had come straight from a gray morning street, his coat still holding the chill, his shoes carrying a little dust from the sidewalk. Mia walked beside him in her school sweater and scuffed sneakers, clutching a small fabric bag against her chest, while Ethan kept one hand close to her shoulder without touching, ready to steady her if the crowd pressed too hard. The lobby was all polished floor and bright white light, with a reception wall that seemed designed to make every ordinary person feel smaller. A digital sign blinked softly behind the desk. Somewhere deeper in the building, an elevator chimed and then fell silent again. Ethan stopped at the front counter and said he was here for a scheduled meeting. Thomas Reed barely looked up from the tablet in his hand before telling him the appointment was not showing on the system. His tone was courteous enough to pass as professional, but his eyes had already measured Ethan's jacket, his old briefcase, the child at his side, and decided they belonged somewhere else. "We'll need you to wait outside," Thomas said, still smiling, as if the words were a favor. The security guard shifted one step closer. Mia looked up at her father, then past him to the massive portrait on the wall. It showed a man in a dark suit standing beneath the same company name Ethan had once helped build, the frame so carefully lit it made the whole wall feel like a shrine. Ethan's face changed for the briefest second when he saw where she was looking, but he did not speak. Instead, he reached down, adjusted Mia's sweater collar with one gentle motion, and asked the receptionist whether there was a bench nearby where she could sit while he sorted it out. That small kindness made the young woman behind the desk blink, as if she had not expected courtesy from the man she had just been told to dismiss. Thomas tapped the edge of the tablet and said there was no reason to continue wasting everyone's time. His words were smooth, but a slight crease appeared between his brows when Mia leaned toward the portrait again, studying the face with a child's sharp, unguarded certainty. Then he saw it too. The same line in the jaw, the same stillness in the eyes, the same quiet gravity Ethan carried without ever asking for it. Ethan noticed the security camera above the reception desk turning slowly toward them, and his gaze dropped for half a second to the small visitor badge clipped backward to Mia's bag, as if even that tiny detail had followed him into the room. He said nothing. He just looked up at the portrait, then at the plaque below it, where one letter had been worn softer than the others. And when Mia pointed again, Thomas Reed did the one thing that told Ethan this was no ordinary mistake. He stepped between them and the wall before anyone else could read the name. Thomas Reed stepped in front of the plaque before anyone else could read the name, and that single move told Ethan everything he needed to know about the room. "Sir, please step to the side," Thomas said, still smiling, one palm open in a gesture that looked polite until you noticed how firmly it blocked the wall. "We're in the middle of a security check." "We have an appointment," Ethan said. "That may be," Thomas replied, his voice gentle as velvet, "but not one that's cleared in the system." The security guard looked at Ethan's briefcase, then at Mia's little bag, then back at Ethan like he had already made up his mind about both of them. The lobby seemed to tighten around the three of them. The air conditioning hummed overhead. Somewhere near the elevators, a muffled chime sounded and stopped. Mia moved half a step closer to her father, and Ethan put a hand lightly on her shoulder without looking down, the way he always did when he wanted her to feel steady without making a scene. Thomas turned his tablet toward the reception desk and spoke as if he were correcting a clerical error, not a human being. "If you'd like, you can submit your request again through normal channels." His eyes slid to Ethan's worn coat, the frayed edge at the cuff, the scuffed heel of his shoe. "We don't want to waste anyone's time," A receptionist near the far end of the counter lowered her gaze to the visitor log, but Ethan caught the tiny hesitation in her fingers before she touched the screen. Her eyes flicked to the old badge clipped backward on Mia's bag, then to the plaque Thomas was still covering with his body. The plaque's lower edge showed a worn letter, softened by years of passing hands and poor polishing. Ethan noticed it, and he noticed Thomas notice him noticing it. "I'm not asking for special treatment," Ethan said quietly. "Just 5 minutes. And I'm telling you," Thomas said, the smile never leaving his face, "that 5 minutes without clearance can become a liability." He spoke the word liability the way some men speak a warning, as if the problem was not the lie but the inconvenience of being caught in one. Mia looked up at the portrait again, her brows drawing together with that hard little concentration children get when something doesn't fit. She had the same expression now that she wore when she was trying to solve a puzzle box on rainy afternoons at home. "Daddy," she whispered. "His picture is right there." Thomas heard her, of course he heard her, but he did not answer the child. He addressed Ethan instead, as if Mia were furniture. "Your daughter can wait over there with the seating area." Over there meant the narrow row of chairs against the glass wall, under a security camera that never stopped blinking. Ethan did not move at first. The guard did. One careful step, then another, not aggressive, just practiced the way people move when they believe the rules are already on their side. The lobby's marble floor reflected everyone's shoes in pale, ghostly fragments. Ethan could smell coffee from somewhere behind reception, mixed with the faint metallic scent of polished steel and the sweeter note of the perfume one of the executives had left hanging in the air when she passed through moments earlier. He looked at the guard, then at Thomas, then at the reception desk where the visitor log sat open, its timestamp glowing softly on the screen. One line near the middle had been updated less than 10 minutes ago. Ethan's eyes held there for a beat too long. Thomas noticed. "Is there a problem?" he asked, and now the tone had cooled just enough to hide the knife under it. Ethan lowered his gaze to Mia and gently straightened the strap of her little bag. "Stay close to me," he said. "Always," she answered, though she was trying not to sound frightened. Thomas gave a small, almost regretful nod, the kind people give when they think they are being decent by enforcing a humiliation. "No one is saying you can't be here," he said. "We're only saying you need the proper access." The word proper hung in the air like a verdict. Claire Bennett had been standing just far enough away to let the scene speak for itself, tablet in hand, expression unreadable. But now her eyes shifted to the visitor log, to the plaque, to the old badge clipped on Mia's bag, and then back to Ethan's face. She had not decided in his favor. Not yet. But something in the way Thomas had stepped in front of the name made her look twice. "Why?" Claire said at last, quiet enough that the nearest employees had to lean in. "Would the plaque be covered if this is only a routine check?" Thomas's smile tightened by a millimeter. The guard glanced at him. The receptionist stopped typing. Ethan did not answer. He only watched Thomas's right hand, the one holding the tablet, because the thumb had begun to tap against the screen in a small, impatient rhythm that did not match the calm he was pretending to wear. Then Claire took one step closer to the wall, and Ethan saw her eyes settle on the visitor log again, this time not as a manager looking for procedure, but as someone beginning to notice that the timestamp on the screen did not quite fit the story Thomas had just told. Claire's eyes stayed on the timestamp for one more beat, and Ethan saw the exact moment she understood it did not belong to Thomas's story. The lobby remained bright and polished and quietly tense, but the air had changed. It felt thinner now, like everyone was waiting for something to break. Thomas kept his smile in place, yet the hand holding the tablet had begun to press too hard against the screen. "If there's nothing else," he said softly, "I'd really prefer not to turn a minor scheduling issue into a spectacle." Ethan didn't answer. He only glanced at Mia, who had gone very still beside him, her fingers wrapped around the strap of her little fabric bag. "Daddy?" she whispered. "Are we in trouble?" He crouched just enough to meet her eyes. "No, sweetheart," he said. "We're just going to wait." That should have been the end of it. Instead, behind the reception desk, a young clerk fumbled with the visitor printer and let out a small, embarrassed breath when the paper jammed again. The machine blinked red, then coughed out a half-printed sheet that slid crookedly onto the counter. Thomas didn't notice. He was still trying to control the room with his voice. The clerk, cheeks burning, bent lower and tugged at the jam with both hands. Ethan watched the paper twist tighter inside the tray. Then, without asking permission or making a show of it, he stepped forward, took the sheet very carefully between two fingers and said, "You're pulling against the feed. It'll tear if you keep forcing it." The girl blinked at him. I know, I just can't get it to catch." Ethan nodded once, set his briefcase down, and leaned over the machine with the quiet focus of a man who had repaired things all his life. His hands moved slowly, not hurried, not proud. He loosened the cover, freed the ribbon, and straightened the curled edge of the paper before sliding it back into place. The printer gave one clean click, then hummed into a steady line. The clerk looked relieved enough to laugh under her breath. "Thank you," she said. Ethan gave her a small nod, and was already stepping back when he noticed the visitor log lying open beside the machine. One line on the page had been printed twice, once in bold black and once in a lighter gray, as if the system had briefly stamped the wrong time before correcting itself. Ethan's eyes settled on that second line for half a second too long. Mia noticed his pause and leaned closer to him. "What is it?" she asked. "Nothing bad," he said, but his voice had gone softer, more careful. Thomas saw the log in Ethan's hand and moved immediately, taking one step toward the desk. "That document is for staff only." "It's your visitor sheet," Ethan replied. "It jammed when the printer jammed." Thomas smiled, the way men smile when they are trying to turn a correction into an offense. "And now it's been handled." He reached for the paper, but Claire lifted a hand before he could touch it. "Let him finish looking," she said. Thomas turned to her with polite surprise, the kind that never reaches the eyes. Ethan didn't push. He simply turned the page a little more toward the light. At the bottom of the log, just beneath the current entry, there was a faint impression from a previous sheet, a shadow of another name and another time that had been pressed through the paper when the stack was first loaded. It wasn't enough to prove anything yet, but it was enough to make Claire lean in. Ethan saw the shadow too, and for an instant something old and tired crossed his face. The look of a man who knew how often small things were the only honest things left. Mia tugged lightly on his sleeve. "Can I sit?" she asked, looking at the hard chair by the glass wall where the guard had pointed them before. Ethan looked over and saw an older woman with a cane standing awkwardly near the same row of seats, waiting because the nearest chair had one broken arm and no one had bothered to move it. Without a word, Ethan picked up the chair himself, carried it 2 steps, and placed it beside the reception wall where it sat level and steady. He then guided Mia onto it before the woman could even ask. "There," he said. "That one's better." The older woman thanked him with a tired smile, and Ethan only nodded back, already brushing a speck of dust from the chair's seat as if that mattered. Thomas exhaled through his nose, unimpressed. "You really don't have to keep helping everyone in the room," he said, making kindness sound like a flaw. Ethan looked at him once, calm and unreadable. "It's not helping," he said quietly. "It's just noticing." Claire did not speak, but her eyes moved from Ethan's hands to the visitor log and then to the clerk's printer, as if she had just realized the printer's mistake was not random at all. The gray duplicate timestamp was still faintly visible at the edge of the page, and Ethan held the sheet with the care of someone who already understood that the smallest misprint in a clean room could be the place where the whole truth started to show. The gray duplicate timestamp on the visitor sheet was still warm from the printer when Claire reached for it, and Thomas moved almost too quickly to fold the page back over with one clean hand. "Old machine," he said lightly, his smile never changing. "Sometimes the feeder doubles a line." Ethan looked at the paper, then at the printer, then at the thin strip of light falling across the counter from the lobby windows. He did not argue. He simply took the sheet back by one corner and angled it toward the light until the faint second imprint beneath the current line became easier to see. The room grew quieter, not because anyone understood it yet, but because everyone could feel that it did not belong. Mia stood close to his side, one small hand resting against the seam of his coat. It was already like that, she said softly, looking at the paper. Before the light went out. Thomas turned to her with the same patient smile adults use when they want children to stop talking. That's very nice, sweetheart, but machines make mistakes. He reached for the log again, but Claire held up one finger, not looking away from the page. The reception clerk, still red-cheeked from the jam, whispered that she had not touched the timestamp at all. Her voice was small, almost apologetic, and that only made Thomas's jaw tighten a fraction. No one said you did, he answered a little too fast. Ethan noticed that. He noticed the speed of it, the way Thomas answered the clerk before she could even finish her sentence, and the way he shifted half a step so his body covered the lower part of the log from Claire's view. Ethan said nothing yet. He leaned closer to the sheet, reading the duplicate line with the calm, narrow focus of a man checking a repair invoice for a crooked number. Then he asked, in a voice so level it nearly disappeared into the hum of the air vents, "Who loaded the paper tray this morning?" The question did something to the room. Thomas stopped smiling. Claire looked up. The guard at the edge of the desk shifted his weight. It was such a simple question that it had nowhere to hide. Thomas recovered first. "Our front desk staff handles paper stock, same as always." He nodded toward the clerk as if that settled it. "We rotate supplies during the morning shift." Ethan's eyes moved to the printer tray, where a thin strip of white paper still curled just inside the feeder. "Then why is the second imprint older than the first?" he asked. Thomas gave a light, almost amused exhale. "Because the printer overheated," he said. "It pressed through the previous sheet." The answer sounded right enough to anyone who wanted to stop listening. Claire did not stop. She stepped closer and lowered the log sheet until the light crossed it from the side, and there it was again. The shadow of a previous entry, not a print error but an impression from another page. A partial line with a different timestamp pushed so lightly it could have been missed if the page had been handled carelessly. Ethan saw it, and for the first time his face changed, not with surprise, but with recognition. "That's not a feeder mark," he said quietly. Thomas's smile thinned. "Excuse me?" Ethan tapped the lower edge of the sheet with one finger, careful not to smear the ink. "The impression goes across the same alignment as the signature block. If it were a printer jam, it would be random. This was stacked." No one spoke for a beat. The lobby's polished floor reflected the scene in fractured white and gray, and in the silence the soft beep of a security scanner sounded twice from somewhere behind the desk. Thomas turned his head just enough to glance at the printer, then back at Ethan, and that glance was all Claire needed to notice the tiny fault line running through his comm. "Stacked by who?" she asked. Thomas lifted one shoulder. "By whoever refilled it. This is not a criminal investigation." He said the word criminal too quickly, as though he had already decided where the conversation should go. Ethan's gaze did not leave the paper. "No," he said, "but it may be a correction." Thomas's eyes flicked to him, sharp now. "You've made your point." "Have I?" Ethan replied, still quiet. He slid the page a little farther into the light, and the faint shadow beneath the bottom line became more legible for one startling second, enough to show a partial timecode that did not match the current visitor entry. Claire's eyebrows drew together. The receptionist leaned forward before catching herself. Mia was the one who noticed the next detail first. She pointed, not at the paper, but at the floor beside the desk, where a tiny damp rectangle had darkened the marble. "Daddy," she whispered. "That came from the printer." Ethan looked down. The shape of the wet mark matched the edge of the log sheet, as if one page had been pulled from the printer while another was still under it. He crouched and touched the corner with the back of his fingers. Ink had bled through only one direction, which meant the page had been pressed together with something else before the final print. Thomas stepped in immediately, too immediately, and placed his shoe over the mark as if to hide it from view. "That's enough," he said, still polite, but now the politeness had cracks in it. "We're not doing this in front of staff." Claire looked from the shoe on the floor to Thomas's face and then to the duplicate timestamp on the page. For the first time, she did not look at Ethan like a disruption. She looked at Thomas like a man explaining something he had already rehearsed too many times. Ethan rose slowly, never breaking the quiet. He folded the visitor sheet once, then unfolded it again so the shadow line would remain visible. And when he spoke, it was only one small sentence, but it made the clerk go still and made Claire's eyes narrow toward the printer tray. That second timestamp, he said, was printed before the first one was supposed to exist. Claire kept the log sheet between two fingers as if she could feel the lie in it. And when Ethan said the second timestamp had been printed before the first was supposed to exist, Thomas answered too quickly. Then we'll have maintenance check the machine and move on. That should have sounded reasonable. Didn't. The words landed in the lobby with the flat, polished tone of a man trying to close a door before anyone noticed it had opened. Ethan looked past him to the receptionist printer still blinking red beside the counter, then at the small crease in the visitor sheet where the two stamps had pressed into each other. No, he said quietly. If the page was stacked, the printer would show it in the feed pattern. This wasn't a jam. This was an override. Thomas's smile held, but his jaw tightened. The security guard glanced down at the machine. Claire did not speak right away. She simply looked from Ethan to the printer and then to Thomas, and for the first time Thomas looked less like a man in control and more like a man trying not to be seen panicking. Can you prove that? Claire asked. Ethan did not puff up with pride. He just set the sheet down, crouched in front of the printer, and studied the tray the way he would study the inside of a broken engine. The lobby quieted around him. A chair stopped scraping on the marble. Somewhere behind the glass doors, a car passed with a low hiss of tires on wet pavement. Mia stayed near the wall, hands folded around the strap of her little bag, watching her father the way she always did when she knew he was being tested. Thomas shifted his weight and said, still polite, "There's no need to make this more complicated than it is. We can file a service note, have IT look at the system, and keep everyone from getting the wrong idea." The phrase wrong idea sat on the air like perfume over a bad smell. Ethan opened the printer side panel instead of replying. He saw the jammed corner instantly, but he also saw something else. The feed rollers had not simply trapped the paper. They had been manually reseated after the fact, just enough to hide the original print order. He lifted the curled edge with two careful fingers, then reached behind the tray and pulled out a thin maintenance slip that had slipped into the machine's back slot. It was smudged at the corner with toner and damp with the printer's heat. Claire's eyes moved to it immediately. Thomas saw it too and stepped half a pace closer, too fast to be casual. Ethan unfolded the slip and scanned the top line. His voice stayed level. This was printed from the admin queue, not the front desk queue. Thomas let out a soft laugh that never reached his eyes. That machine runs on the same network as the desk. Not when the secure feed is locked, Ethan replied. He tapped one tiny line on the slip, a code that marked a later reprint. This page was pulled from a delayed job. Someone wanted a clean copy after the original had already been stamped. The room seemed to inhale and forget how to exhale. Claire took one step forward. What original? Ethan looked up at her, then at the visitor log. The original log entry, he said. The one that was printed before the clock rolled over. He held the maintenance slip under the lobby light and turned it slightly until the code became clearer. A timestamp sat in the corner, faint but legible, and beside it a security export ID that did not belong to any normal front desk process. Thomas moved at once, reaching for the paper again with a smile so smooth it almost fooled the eye. I'm sure there's a simple explanation. Ethan did not let him take it. He did not pull it away sharply or make a scene. He simply lifted the page a little higher, just out of reach, with the calm of someone who had spent years learning how to protect something without inviting a fight. Then say it, he said. Thomas's eyes flicked to Claire, then to the receptionist, then to the guard. For just a second, his polished certainty slipped. The machine probably cached an old job, he said. It happens. But the maintenance slip in Ethan's hand had a handwritten note across the bottom edge, faint and hurried. A note the ink had almost rubbed away, hold until review. Claire saw it. Ethan saw her see it. The clerk behind the desk looked between them and swallowed hard. Mia frowned and pointed, not at the note, but at the tiny barcode strip at the bottom of the page. "That one's not from today," she said. "It looks old." Her voice was small, but it landed exactly where it needed to. Ethan gave her a brief nod without turning the moment into praise. "It is old," he said. "It was cued, held, then reprinted." Thomas's hand closed into a fist at his side, then opened again. "We're not doing a forensic audit in the lobby." His tone stayed courteous, but now there was a crease of irritation in it, the first crack in the mask. Claire reached out and took the slip from Ethan with deliberate slowness. She didn't trust it yet. She was simply refusing to ignore it. Her eyes moved across the code, and then to the visitor log, and then toward the bank of security monitors mounted by the wall. "I want the original digital file," she said. The guard looked to Thomas. The receptionist stopped breathing for a moment. "No one has deleted anything," Thomas said quickly. Too quickly. He tried to recover with a softer smile. "I'm only trying to keep this calm." Ethan straightened from the printer and brushed a line of toner dust off his thumb. "Then keep the original footage," he said. "If it matches the log, we're done." Thomas turned toward the monitor wall, and Ethan noticed what Claire noticed at the same time. One of the screens had a black rectangle across the top corner, a clean cut in the camera feed where 4 minutes should have been. Not a glitch, not a blur. A cut. Claire's expression shifted, just slightly, from caution to suspicion. She lifted her phone and typed a single message without looking away from the monitors. The printer beside the desk gave one small mechanical click, then went still. Ethan's gaze stayed on the dead slice of footage, and when he spoke again it was almost to himself. "Someone didn't just misprint the log," he said. "They trimmed the room." The black rectangle in the corner of the security screen sat there like a missing tooth, and Ethan stared at it long. Enough to know it had not appeared by accident. Claire looked down at the maintenance slip still in her hand, then at the dead slice of footage, and for the first time her expression changed from caution to something closer to disbelief. "4 minutes are gone," she said quietly. Thomas lifted a hand as if the air itself had become inconvenient. "We can restore the feed later," he said. "There's no need to turn this into a production." But his voice had gone tighter, and his eyes were no longer resting on Ethan. They kept flicking to the monitor wall, to Claire's phone, to the reception desk, as if he were measuring how much of the room he could still control. Ethan said nothing. He stepped closer to the monitors, not to accuse, only to see. On the lower edge of one screen, beneath the black rectangle, there was a faint system identifier that matched the export code on the maintenance slip. The two marks lined up so cleanly that the lie stopped feeling like a single mistake and started feeling like a pattern. Claire saw it too. She moved her phone to one hand and typed again, this time with her thumb steadier than before, then looked up at the receptionist. "Do not clear any logs," she said. "Do not refresh the feed. Save the original file exactly as it is." The clerk nodded too quickly, pale now, and Ethan noticed the way her fingers had begun to tremble at her side. Thomas turned toward her immediately, gentleness returning like a mask being lifted from the floor. "No one is deleting anything," he said. "We're just trying to keep the lobby calm." Ethan heard the emphasis on calm and almost smiled, not because it was funny, but because calm had become the word people used when they wanted truth to wait outside the door. He folded the maintenance slip once and laid it flat on the reception counter beneath the light. The paper looked ordinary there, almost fragile. But the handwritten note at the bottom, "Hold until review," was still visible, and the pressure mark beneath it suggested it had been stacked under a second document before being pulled free. Ethan ran one thumb over the edge and said, "This wasn't a random printer error. Someone queued a log, held it, and reprinted it through admin access." The room went very still. A woman near the elevator stopped, whispering mid-sentence. The guard's hand lowered from his belt. Mia reached for Ethan's sleeve, not afraid now, just close. Thomas gave a small laugh that sounded more like a cough. "You speak very confidently for someone without a badge." He regretted the words the moment they left his mouth, because Claire's head tilted a fraction at the tone. Ethan did not answer the insult. He looked instead at the monitor wall and then at Claire's phone when it buzzed once in her hand. She glanced at the screen, and the color left her face just enough to be visible. She turned the phone around and showed Ethan the message without saying a word. It was from security operations. Archived lobby footage had been restored in part, and one file showed manual interruption from an internal admin terminal. Not a technical failure. A hand had done it. Thomas saw the message reflected in the glass of the lobby doors and moved at once, stepping between Claire and Ethan again as if his body could still protect the story from being read. "That's an internal note," he said. "It should be handled privately." Claire didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on the evidence in her hand. "It already isn't private," she said. The words were soft, but they landed harder than a shout. Ethan felt the air shift. Even the receptionist straightened. Even Mia stopped fidgeting. The lobby, with its polished floor and white walls and expensive quiet, had become the kind of room where the smallest mistake could no longer hide. And then the clerk behind the desk spoke, barely above a whisper. "Sir," she said to Thomas, "you told me this morning to reprint the entry sheet after the first one came out." Thomas turned too fast. "I told you to reprint the visitor welcome sheet." The clerk blinked, and Ethan watched the exact moment she realized the difference between what had been said and what was now being claimed. "No," she said, still soft but firmer now. "You said to pull the time from the first print because it looked messy." Thomas's throat worked once. He smiled again, but now it looked painful. "You may be remembering it wrong." Claire's gaze sharpened. "Are you saying she's mistaken?" Thomas opened his mouth, then closed it. And in that small pause, Ethan caught something else. The slick edge of a phone screen disappearing into Thomas's palm as he lowered his hand behind the counter. He had tried to hide the phone. He had tried to check it without being seen. Ethan noticed the vibration buzz a second later when it lit against the side of his jacket. On the screen, as far as Ethan could glimpse, was a name he did not know, followed by a short line of text that made Thomas's shoulders harden even further. Claire noticed the movement too. "Hand it over," she said. Thomas let out a controlled breath and turned the phone face down on the counter as though that made him appear calmer. "This is absurd." Ethan leaned just enough to see the edge of the device. On the notification banner was a file name, partially visible before the screen dimmed again. Lobby_cut_0 4-minute_admin export. The words were small, but they changed the shape of the room. Claire's attention moved from the phone to Thomas's face, and then past him to the security screen. "There was an export," she said. "And you knew before I did." Thomas's mouth opened, and for the first time there was no polished sentence waiting there. "I was informed after the fact," he said. "There's no reason to escalate this in front of staff." "That's exactly why we are not handling it behind closed doors," Claire replied. Ethan stood very still. He could feel Mia's hand in his coat now, tiny fingers tugging once, as if she could sense the room turning without understanding why. He lowered his chin to her and said, "You're doing fine." Not because she was in danger, but because he wanted her to know what it looked like when adults stopped lying. Then he looked back at the monitor, where the black rectangle remained, and said to Claire, "Whoever cut the feed knew which 4 minutes mattered." Claire did not answer immediately. Instead, she lifted the maintenance slip closer to her eyes, then glanced at the security screen, then at Thomas, and what had been a quiet suspicion became something heavier and colder. She finally said, "This doesn't look like one mistake." And with the lobby standing silent around them, Ethan understood that the printer, the log, and the missing footage were not separate problems at all. They were the first visible edge of a much larger lie, one that had been shaped long before he walked through these doors. By the time the company atrium filled, the morning light had climbed high enough to turn the glass ceiling white and hard, and the whole room felt like it had been set inside a bell jar. Employees stood in careful rows near the polished floor, not crowding, not speaking too loudly, but watching with the still attention people reserve for a moment they know will decide something. Ethan walked in beside Mia without hurry, his coat hanging open, his briefcase still in his hand, his face tired but steady. Claire stood near the front with a folder, a phone, and the maintenance slip Ethan had handed her earlier. Thomas was already there, perfectly placed near the center of the atrium as if he had been waiting for a stage. He looked calm enough to pass for helpful, and when he spoke his voice carried the soft certainty of a man used to being believed first. "Thank you all for giving this a few minutes," he said. "There's been some confusion over a visitor log and an outdated printer file. We're going to clear this up and move on." A few people nodded because that was the kind of sentence a polished manager could use to make a problem sound small. Then Thomas turned to Ethan with the same apologetic smile he had used in the lobby. "Mr. Callahan came in without a confirmed access record," he said. "His daughter recognized a portrait, and that understandably caused emotion. But emotion is not evidence." Ethan said nothing. He only looked up at the portrait hanging above the atrium's inner wall. The same face, the same dark suit, the same plaque beneath it now lit by daylight instead of lobby glare. Mia stood close enough to touch her father's sleeve, her eyes moving from the portrait to the screen Claire had set up at the front. Claire did not interrupt Thomas. She simply lifted the visitor log sheet and held it where the whole room could see the duplicate. "Timestamp. This is the first thing we checked," she said. "2 stamps. 2 times. One should not have printed over the other." Thomas gave a little laugh, as if he could still make this seem technical and harmless. "Old equipment does that." Claire nodded once, not agreeing, only acknowledging that he had chosen to try. "Then explain," she said, "why the second imprint is older than the first." A murmur passed through the room. Thomas's smile held, but the skin around his eyes tightened. He gestured to the maintenance slip, trying to guide the audience back toward a simpler explanation. "Printer jobs can overlap. We already know this machine had a feeder issue." Ethan took one step forward, then stopped. Not because he lacked courage, but because he knew the room was watching every movement, and he had no intention of turning truth into a performance. Claire opened the folder and slid out the restored security export. "We also found this," she said. On the screen behind her, the atrium camera feed appeared with the missing 4 minutes marked by a black block in the corner, and a small code beneath it matching the admin export ID on the maintenance slip. A few employees leaned forward. Thomas glanced at the screen and then back at Claire, and for the first time his confidence looked like it had to be carried. "A glitch," he said quickly. "An internal export issue. That happens." That was the first spike, the moment he almost won the room by making the lie sound ordinary. He even lifted one hand, open-palmed, and added, "We are not in the business of humiliating staff over routine errors." The phrase landed badly because everyone in the atrium knew exactly who had been humiliated. Mia's fingers tightened around Ethan's coat. Ethan lowered his chin toward her for a brief second, then looked back up at Thomas and said, "Then don't call it routine if you had to cut the footage to make it look clean." The room went quieter. Thomas's smile faltered just enough to show irritation. Claire reached into the folder again and held up the maintenance slip, the handwritten note visible at the bottom. "Hold until review," she read aloud. "That's not a front desk note. That's a direction from admin access." Thomas's mouth opened, but before he could speak, the receptionist from the lobby stepped out from the second row of employees, face pale and hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. "He told me to reprint the sheet," she said, her voice shaking only on the first word. The atrium shifted around that sentence like a floorboard under weight. Thomas turned toward her too fast. "I told you to adjust the visitor welcome copy." The clerk shook her head once, small but certain. "No, sir. You told me the time looked messy, and to use the cleaner one." That was the second spike, the crack that made the room stop pretending it was just a paperwork issue. A few people actually looked at Thomas now instead of through him. Claire's eyes moved from the clerk to Ethan and back again. Ethan did not smile. He only reached into his coat pocket and drew out the old badge that had been clipped backward to Mia's bag in the lobby, the edge of it worn smooth from years of use. He held it where the daylight hit the scratched surface, and the atrium went very still. "This badge," he said, his voice low and even, "opened doors before anyone here decided it didn't belong to me anymore." Thomas's face tightened, but he still had one more layer to reach for. "You could have brought that in here from anywhere," he said, now louder than before, trying to recover the room through doubt. "A sentimental object doesn't prove ownership." Ethan nodded once, as if he had expected exactly that answer. Then he handed the badge to Claire, not to shame Thomas, but to keep the argument on the side of evidence where he wanted it. Claire turned the badge over in her hand and found the matching serial number from the archive file. Her expression changed. Not fully, not yet, but enough that Thomas noticed it and shifted his weight. Claire looked up at him. "This serial matches the founder access record," she said. "It should have been retired years ago. Why is it tied to a live export terminal?" Thomas answered too slowly this time. "Because old inventory gets reused." Ethan looked past him to the screen, where the missing footage still sat as a black cut across the corner. "Not if someone cut 4 minutes out of it," he said. His tone was not angry. That was what made it heavier. Not if someone wanted the room to remember the wrong version. The employees in the atrium had gone almost silent now, with only the soft rustle of suits and a distant elevator ding breaking the air. Mia stood on her toes and pointed at the screen, then at the portrait just once, as if she were reminding everyone which thing they were pretending not to see. Claire saw the motion, and for a moment her gaze softened toward the child before hardening again on the evidence. Thomas tried one last smooth turn, one last attempt to push this back into procedure. "We can review this privately," he said. "There's no need to broadcast internal records to the entire floor." But Ethan answered before Claire could. "You made it public when you put me in front of my daughter and called me a mistake." That sentence held the whole room in place. No one coughed. No one moved. Even the air seemed to pause inside the glass walls. Claire looked from Ethan to the screen and then, with a deliberate calm that told everyone the balance had shifted, she reached into her folder and drew out a sealed envelope marked with the company archive stamp. Her fingers rested on the flap, but she did not open it yet. "Before we go any further," she said, her voice level and careful, "I want everyone here to see the original file that came back with the restored export." Claire slit the archive envelope open with her thumb, and the first thing that fell out was a folded original registry page with the company seal still embossed in the corner. She did not read it aloud at first. She held it flat against the light, then turned it toward the screen so everyone in the atrium could see the name printed at the top line before anyone could deny it. Ethan Callahan, founder. The room did not react all at once. It went still in stages, like breath leaving a crowd one person at a time. Thomas's hand dropped to his side, and the pen he had been holding slipped from his fingers and clicked once against the marble floor. That tiny sound seemed louder than anything else in the building. Claire looked at the page again, then at Ethan, then at the badge in her other hand. "This is the original incorporation record," she said, her voice calm but unmistakably changed. "It was never retired. It was buried." Thomas tried to speak, but his throat worked before any words came out. He reached for the folder on the table, then stopped when Claire set the registry page down beside the restored maintenance slip and the visitor log, lining all 3 pieces up as if she were laying out the edges of a lock. On the screen behind her, the restored footage began to play. Not the black cut, the missing 4 minutes. The atrium speakers gave one small hiss, then the audio came through thin at first, then clear enough to hear Thomas's own voice from the lobby recording. "Reprint it," he said on the playback, brisk and low. "Use the cleaner timestamp. The first one looks messy." A ripple moved through the room. Not a gasp, not a shout, just the sound of people realizing the room they were standing in had been lying to them in a language they had all pretended not to understand. Mia's fingers tightened around Ethan's sleeve. He looked down at her, and the little girl looked up at him with wet eyes that were not scared anymore. She did not speak. She only stepped closer and pressed her forehead briefly against his side, as if the truth had finally given her permission to rest. Thomas turned sharply toward Claire. "That audio can be taken out of context," he said, but the words were dry now, stripped of the shine that had carried them earlier. Claire did not raise her voice. She simply reached for the page again and held it under the projector beam. "Then explain why the archived registry matches the founder access badge. The badge serial matches the old terminal, and the footage shows someone in admin removing the original timestamp." Thomas swallowed. The movement was visible even from the back rows. He glanced toward the monitor wall, then away from it, avoiding the camera as though it might still protect him. "I was told to preserve the brand history," he said at last, and the excuse came out thin and damaged. "After the transition, we needed consistency." Ethan lifted his eyes to him, not with anger, but with that still, exhausted patience of a man who had spent too long watching other people polish over what they broke. "You didn't preserve history," he said. "You edited it." The words landed without force and somehow hit harder because of that. Claire moved to the front of the screen and opened the second page in the envelope. It was a board memo, old and official, with the signatures visible in blue ink. Her finger paused over one line, then tapped it once. "This is the handoff note," she said. "And this signature is not Thomas's. It belongs to a former executive who no longer works here." That was the moment the room changed completely. Several employees leaned forward at once. A man near the back lowered his phone because he no longer needed to record. The evidence was already doing the speaking. Thomas's lips parted, then closed. The mask was still on his face, but it no longer fit. Claire looked up from the memo. "You kept him out of the record," she said, meaning Ethan. "You kept the founder off the floor. You cut the footage. You altered the log. And you made a child stand in front of her own father and question whether the portrait was telling the truth." The clerk behind the desk made a small sound and covered her mouth with one hand. The guard lowered his shoulders. No one in the atrium was laughing now. Not one person. The silence felt so complete it made the projector's soft fan noise easy to hear, and even that sound seemed to slow down as the room absorbed what was happening. Ethan did not look at Thomas. He looked at Mia. She held his gaze for a second, then gave the smallest nod, as if she were saying she understood enough now. Claire turned back to the employees and made her decision in a voice that was steady and public. "Thomas Reed is suspended effective immediately pending formal review," she said. "Security operations will be reassigned. All records tied to the founder archive will be restored today, and the original company history will be corrected in the system before the end of business." Thomas closed his eyes for one brief second. When he opened them, he looked smaller, not because anyone had humiliated him, but because the truth had removed all the places he had hidden. Ethan finally stepped forward, not toward Thomas, but toward the screen. He placed the old badge on the table beneath the registry page and left it there. No flerist, no triumph. Just the quiet finality of a man returning what had always belonged to the record. "That's enough," he said, and the words were almost gentle. Claire glanced at him, then at Mia, then back to the audience, who still had not found their voices. She had done the legal part. She had done the public part. But there was still one thing she had not done. She had not asked Ethan what he wanted now that the room had finally gone silent. And as Mia slipped her hand into her father's, the question waiting in the air was no longer whether the truth would be believed. It was what Ethan Callahan would choose to do with the name, the power, and the second chance just placed back in his hands.